So today I wanted to study with you a philosophical and theological and historical debate about how to commemorate the Holocaust. More specifically, about when to commemorate the Holocaust. And what I hope that we see today is that these various debates and the various positions and even the polemics around when and how to commemorate the Holocaust not only reflect different views about the Holocaust itself, its meaning and its place in history and in Jewish history, but they also reflect broader debates around Jewish identity, Jewish theology, and Jewish politics. Now, it shouldn't surprise us that a debate about when to commemorate the Holocaust, a debate around the calendar, should prove to be controversial. We know that historically speaking, the calendar is often the site of big debates around Jewish identity. If you think about the Karaites and the Rabbinites, for example, that a lot of their debates 1,000 years ago generated, a lot of their debates were actually centered around the calendar. And if we think about it, the calendar, at least the rabbinic calendar, has been set for centuries, if not millennia. And it should come as no surprise to us that the attempt to make a substantive intervention in the Jewish calendar around Yom HaShoah and around Yom HaAtzmaut and Yom HaZikaron should have generated a tremendous amount of controversy. Now, there's, I would say, two major positions around when to commemorate the Holocaust. The first position is that the Holocaust should be commemorated on Tisha B'Av, today, the anniversary of the two destructions of the Jerusalem temples, along with other tragedies in Jewish history. And this goes along with some pretty significant implications, theologically and politically. For example, that the Holocaust is not unprecedented. It's not unique, that it is part of a long series of Jewish suffering, of Jewish persecution, of Jewish trauma, going back generations. And we'll unpack more of these implications along with the strengths and the weaknesses of commemorating the Holocaust on Tisha B'Av. There's another school of thought which says that the Holocaust requires its own independent day of commemoration that's distinct from Tisha B'Av. And that day has become Yom HaShoah, the 27th day of the month of Nisan. And it should be noted, and hopefully we'll be able to get into some of this, that designating Yom HaShoah on that particular day, the 27th day of Nisan, was also the product of much controversy and many debates, and was actually the result of a political compromise in the Knesset. And designating Yom HaShoah as the day for commemorating the Holocaust also carries very serious political and theological implications. There's a third model that I want to bring up, even though I'm sure we're not going to get to it today, but I want to bring it up because it is a model, and it's a model that we draw from, that we can use the destruction of the temple as a template, where we don't designate one particular day. We don't even use the calendar as a means for commemorating the Holocaust, but rather we use constant physical, tangible means of commemorating the temple and perhaps for commemorating the Holocaust. Things like leaving a corner of your house unpainted, leaving out one course of a luxurious meal, smashing a glass at a wedding, that we do these things in a kind of ongoing way that they're small, they're rote, they're maybe even banal or perfunctory, but we create these ongoing ambient ways of commemorating the Holocaust so that on the one hand, it does become somewhat rote, but on the other hand, we are constantly surrounded by small interventions in our life so that the Holocaust is always, or commemorating the Holocaust or the memory of the Holocaust is always around us. And we find this model in the Gemara. I wanted to just pause for a second and ask if there are other ways, a fourth or fifth way of commemorating the Holocaust that you can think of. I mentioned the calendar, either Tisha B'Av or Yom HaShoah, and I also mentioned small, tangible things we can do on an ongoing basis to remember the Holocaust. But I want to ask if there's something that that people in their own lives do, or if institutions do that I haven't mentioned yet. I should also say, by the way, that that this third model of these small things you can do that are somewhat tangible or physical, they actually do this type of thing in Germany. If you're familiar with the Stolperstein, I'm not sure if I pronounced that right, but these like these cobblestones that are on the street that mark where Jewish people had lived. I think what that means literally is they're stumbling stones. So they're a little bit protruded from the street and you're meant to stumble upon them. Or in Berlin, I know that there are street signs which also have the Nuremberg laws written on the street signs. And so you're walking along Berlin and all of a sudden, and I've had this experience, all of a sudden you turn someplace and you see Jews may not attend university, may not attend German universities. So those are these small reminders. And I think that in a lot of ways, we have the model in Jewish history commemorating the temple in this way as well. Okay, let's get started with the first.
There's two. Can you hear me?
Yes,
sorry,
please.
Is that Audrey?
Yeah.
Yes. There's 2 other days in the calendar now. You know, there's the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz on January 27th.
Yes.
And it just started this year on June 24th, this day in honor of Holocaust survivors.
So it's
all a little bit confusing, but it gives more opportunity to hear more stories and more remembrances. So
great. I was familiar with the January date. I was not familiar with the June date. So thank you for bringing that up. And I think that, Audrey, that really hits on one of the questions that we're going to be asking, which is, should we be limiting mourning or should we be expanding opportunities to mourn, especially as the number of survivors who can give us eyewitness testimony are actually dwindling? So I think that raises a really important point. I wanted to start with this model of using Tisha B'Av to commemorate the Holocaust. So in November 1942, the news of the atrocities unfolding in Europe reached Palestine. Prior to this, there had been rumors that had come to Palestine, but people had generally dismissed them as rumors or exaggerations. And it was only in November 1942 that eyewitness reports had reached Palestine of this systematic genocide and extermination that had been going on in Europe, and it was impossible to dismiss this news anymore. And at this point in November, the Jewish Agency Executive, the highest governing body of the Yishuv, met and they proposed a number of things. Number one, they said, let's devote an entire month to mourn the victims of Nazi Germany. They also proposed 3 designated days of alarm, protest, and action. And they also set aside days for prayer and fasting. And that's what I want to focus on. The chief rabbinate played a major role in determining this religious reaction. Rabbi Herzog, who was the Ashkenaz chief rabbi of Israel and who is related, but I forget how, to the new president of Israel, and anybody can feel free to chime in with the exact relationship, I don't remember.
His grandfather.
His grandfather. Okay, so it was his grandfather. He declared December 2nd, 1942 to be a day of fasting and mourning, and he invited rabbis from all over the world to join with him in doing this. He invited rabbis from India, Syria, Turkey, England, America, and Australia. And on that day, thousands of Jews assembled at the Churva synagogue. They marched to the Kotel. The Gera Rebbe led these thousands of Jews in prayer. They blew the shofar. They recited, it was December, but they recited selections from Eicha, and they recited Kinot. But there was one rabbi who refused to participate. Rabbi Herzog had approached the Grizz, Rabbi Yitzchak Zev Halevi Soloveitchik, and asked him to endorse this day of prayer and fasting. The Grizz was living in Jerusalem, although he had only recently emigrated from Europe, and the Grizz said no. The Grizz said, I'm not going to endorse this, and I'm not going to participate in this. And he based this on the following source. Can everybody see this? Okay, great. So he based this on on a kina that we recite on Tisha B'Av, and I don't know if we recited this in shul today. This is kina number 25, Mi Yitain Roshi Mayim. I'm going to read this kina. I'll just expand it a little bit, and then give a little bit of the historical background and explain why the Grizz used this kina to justify his refusal to participate in this global day of prayer and fasting, both as a mourning and as intercession for the Jews of Nazi Europe. Would that my head were water and my eyes a fountain of tears, and I would cry all my days and nights for the corpses of my babes and infants and the aged of my community. I ask you to respond, oh woe, alas, and weep, oh weeping, much weeping. Take this to heart and compose a bitter eulogy. Now here's the key. Their murder is worthy of mourning and placing ash. Now, whose murder? We're going to talk about that. Equal to the burning of the house of our God, the porch and the palace, because it is improper to add a day of breach or brokenness and conflagration, and wrong to advance the date, rather to postpone it. Therefore today, Tisha B'Av, I will arouse my grief and lament and wail and cry with bitter soul, with sighs weighing heavily from dawn to dusk, for the house of Israel and the people of the Lord who have fallen, by sword. Now, this was written by Kalanimus ben Yehuda of Speyer, and that should indicate what this kina, or who this kina is mourning and lamenting. This kina is mourning and lamenting the massacres of the three communities of Worms, Mainz, and Speyer, who were decimated by the Crusaders on their way to the Holy Land. Now, in the year 1096, these bands of Crusaders decided to go and reclaim the Holy Land, the land of Israel, from the Muslims. On their route, they encountered Jewish communities, and some of these communities, and they said to themselves, we're going all the way to kill Muslim infidels, and we have Jewish infidels right before us. Now, there were very complicated histories that unfolded in these communities. Some of these communities were massacred, they were just killed. Some of these communities, it should be said, were protected by the bishops of these towns. Some of these Jews killed themselves rather than submit to the Crusaders, and more radically and more really uniquely, sui generously, crazily, some of these communities actually killed, some of the Jews killed their own children, siblings, husbands killed wives, neighbors killed each other. It was Jews killing Jews rather than submitting, rather than let the Crusaders forcibly baptize them or kill them. They wanted to die al kiddush Hashem, or rather, I should say, they wanted to die at the hands of Jews rather than die at the hands of these crusaders. Now, we know this historically. These are not just the stuff of legends. We know this historically because many of these events were written down in Hebrew chronicles after the event. Now, and I want to just hone in on one line. These events, I should say, happened during the period of the Omer. At least these three towns, Worms, Speyer, and Mainz, these towns were destroyed between Pesach and Shavuot, closer to the time of Shavuot. And yet what this author is saying is that even though they happened during the Omer, I am going to postpone mourning them until Tisha B'Av. Why? Because it is improper. He says, "V'chi ein lehosif moed shever v'tav eira." It's improper to add another day on the calendar, and therefore I am going to mourn these towns and these victims on Tisha B'Av instead of mourning them during the Omer. And it's on this basis that the Grizz, Rabbi Soloveitchik of Brisk, refused to participate in this global day of prayer and fasting. Now, I would love to hear from you any reactions to this, either to the Kina, to this idea, to this author stating that he's not mourning the deaths and the destruction of his communities when they actually happened, but rather is postponing the mourning to Tisha B'Av. Or I would love to hear what you think about the Grizz and the Grizz's deployment of this Kina as justification for not participating in the mourning of Jews of Nazi Europe. Yeah, Rabbi Martyr, please.
I'm wondering whether or not he's describing not mourning them or that establishing an annual date of commemoration and national mourning continuously is the focus. That certainly they mourned. Everybody sat their shiva and they all grieved together. But they did not want to create a new calendar date is a different kind of question.
Great. Yes, I'm curious what you think about then what the Grizz does, because is there a difference between establishing a new permanent national day of mourning versus something terrible is unfolding and we do a temporary day of fasting and mourning? Because we do that. I mean, we do that all the time. I think I remember that recently we did something like that. Maybe it was for Lag BaOmer, maybe it was for COVID, but we do introduce temporary days of fasting. But yes, I definitely hear that. I definitely hear that interpretation of Kalonymus and of and perhaps of the Grizz. I should say, by the way, that we know for certain that in the wake of the Khmelnytsky massacres in the 17th century, there was a day of fasting that was proposed. There's even, and we also know that there were types of mourning that were enacted after the Crusaders massacred these towns. Even if it wasn't fast days, we know that, for example, Av HaRachamim came into play, where at least in Ashkenaz Sidurim and in Ashkenaz shuls, we actually recite a type of dirge on Shabbat, which is something radical. We don't, as individuals, we don't mourn on Shabbat, and yet we do have various liturgical interventions on Shabbat, which were made, and it seems permanently, in the wake of the Crusades. Brandon, I saw that you unmuted.
No, I was just going to ask just maybe a broader question. I mean, I see both sides in that if you single out a particular event, does it to a certain extent diminish all of the heartache and pain of the Jewish people overall? And is that a good thing or not? And I could sort of see both sides. And I think maybe to Rabbi Martyr's point a little bit, mourners, like if you suffer a loss individually, you sit Shiva and you focus yourself, but once you bring it up to the community level, I could see why there'd be a lot more scrutiny and concern about sort of making it a communal event, because you could argue it diminishes the weight of all of the other calamity, unfortunately, in our history.
Right. And I mean, I'm even seeing what Rachel wrote in the chat, that there are so many tragedies that have befallen the Jewish people. There are literally not enough days on the calendar to commemorate all of them. And not only that, do we want a calendar which is blood-soaked? Do we want a calendar? Do we want what a professor of mine in college, Professor Yerushalmi, said, do we want a lachrymose theory of Jewish history, where the entire calendar is about crying and lamenting all of the tragedies and all of the suffering and all the persecution that have befallen Jewish people? Yeah, Shira.
So I guess I will play devil's advocate a little bit, and I think it depends. I mean, I think unfortunately we do have a very difficult blood-soaked history, and we don't frankly want it. We wouldn't, as a people, sort of want a day for each one of them. I do think there's a case to be made for these temporary days, but I also think certain events, and I think everyone on the call would agree, the Holocaust is one of them. I mean, just like the Churban is one of them that we commemorate, the Holocaust is qualitatively, quantitatively different. And I think that was why it was eventually decided upon, that we do need specific days or a specific day to focus on just that. But I think that we don't necessarily want permanent days on the calendar for all of these things. But I'm not sure I go with the Grizz. It sounds like he should have, if it seemed appropriate to do this temporary day at the very least, and then, go from there. So.
Great. And really, you're right. It's not just that the Grizz resisted this temporary day, but his position, which was strong and unyielding, that there is only one day of mourning on the Jewish calendar, and that is Tisha B'Av, and we do not establish any new days of mourning, proved quite influential later on. And it served as the basis for people like Rav Moshe to say, we don't do Yom HaShoah, but rather we rely on Tisha B'Av. We use Tisha B'Av as a way of mourning, the Holocaust.
Sara's giving a class.
So it's worth mentioning, by the way, that there already was an association between Tisha B'Av and the Holocaust in 1942. First of all, there was the rally at MSG a few days before Tisha B'Av. It was July 21st, 1942, where Mayor LaGuardia actually addressed, I think it was a crowd of 20,000 Jews and others who gathered at MSG to protest the Nazi atrocities unfolding in Europe. The chief rabbi of England composed a special prayer to be recited on Tisha B'Av in 1942. And I think most notably, the chaplain of the House of Representatives opened the session on Tisha B'Av with a prayer for the Jews of Nazi Europe. So there was already some type of association in 1942 between Tisha B'Av and what came to be called the Holocaust. I wanted to spend a little bit of time thinking about the source for this model, that Tisha B'Av is the only day that we mourn Jewish tragedies. And I'm happy to send these sources out later on if anybody wants. So I think the source for this is actually in the Gemara, where the Gemara discusses 5 calamities that occurred on Shiva Asar B'Tammuz 3 weeks ago, and 5 calamities that occurred on Tisha B'Av. So here we go. On the 9th of Av, it was decreed upon our ancestors that they would all die in the wilderness and not enter Eretz Yisrael. That was 1. The Beit HaMikdash was destroyed for the first time. That's 2. The second time, that's 3. Beitar was captured. That's 4. And then the city of Jerusalem was plowed over. Now, this idea that calamities or tragedies happen in bulk almost on the same day, I think you can read that in 2 different ways. One way is to read that literally, maybe even astrologically, or maybe that God dictates that Jewish tragedies happen in one period of time on one day. I think there's another way of reading that, which is a little bit more expansive or a little bit more figurative, which is not that every Jewish tragedy happens on 1 or 2 or 3 days, but rather that we designate 1 or maybe 2 days to mourn all Jewish tragedies. That the mourning for these events gets concentrated or consolidated into 1 day. So then the question becomes, well, if we're going to use Tisha B'Av as a receptacle for mourning or commemorating the Holocaust, how do we do it? What are the tools and the mechanisms at our disposal? So one tool that we have is to compose kinot. And we know that, like I just read, there were kinot that were composed for the victims of the Crusader massacres, the Rhineland massacres. There were kinot that were composed for the burning of the Talmud. There were kinot that were composed for the Asara Harugei Malchut, the 10 rabbinic martyrs of the Romans. And there's also room to compose kinot for the Holocaust. And of course, that has been done. And they have a distinct and unique place in the Tisha B'Av liturgy. But interestingly, there is some resistance put forward to the idea that we can compose new kinot for the Holocaust. The nephew of the Griz, the Rav, Rabbi Soloveitchik, who it should be said was a Zionist and one of the, if not the intellectual architect of modern Orthodoxy, had 2 important positions vis-a-vis this question. One, in line with his uncle, the Rav said that the Tisha B'Av is the day that we should be commemorating all Jewish tragedy, including the Holocaust. I think even more provocatively, the Rav said that no new kinot should be composed, that the kinot of Tisha B'Av that we already have are sufficient and are not just sufficient, but are representative of the Holocaust as well. Now, I'm actually curious to hear, I don't know if Rabbi Martyr or if anybody else on this call knows how Yom HaShoah was commemorated at YU while the Rav was alive. I don't know anything about that, whether this position that Tisha B'Av is the day to commemorate the Holocaust ended up getting played out at YU or not. I don't know. I think it's Sarich Yun. I'm curious. Rabbi Martyr, you're muted.
I don't know if he followed his uncle's approach to this. We certainly had Yom HaShoah commemorations happening in the yeshiva. It was a long time ago, admittedly, but I don't think he was reticent in that way. He was very conservative about his belief that keynotes were written by divine inspiration, by Ruach HaKodesh,
Yes.
in the hands of those writers, and we are too small to pen such things in our day. And that might have been, I think, a choice that was a bad choice on his part. But I don't think that he evaded that, as my memory tells me, in terms of how things were commemorated at YU.
Okay, great. So we'll come back to that. We'll come back to his position about Tisha B'Av, but I want to spend a little bit of time on his position vis-a-vis keynote. So one thing, yes, like Rabbi Martyr said, it's a question of authority. Nobody today has the spiritual authority or gravitas to compose new prayers, including new keynote. And maybe he was also saying that the task was so monumental, that the tragedy was beyond comprehension. Even those who experienced the tragedy, he was basically saying, did not have the authority to compose new keynote. He also argues that there was a strong continuity between what happened in the past, whether it was in Worms or whether it was in Jerusalem, and what was happening in the present. This reinforces the idea that the Holocaust is not new, it's not unprecedented, it comfortably belongs to past paradigms of actual events. And I want to read something from the Rav's keynote, which my father-in-law helped edit. The Rav writes, or this might be a paraphrase of what the Rav had said. The phrase, "Where are Torah, Talmud, and students," which is a phrase from one of the keynote, was the phrase used by a Holocaust survivor to describe to me his feelings at visiting Vilna on Kol Nidrei night in 1945. Shortly after he was liberated, he returned to Vilna, where he had lived before the war, for the high holidays. It is difficult to describe what Vilna looked like on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur before the war. In one neighborhood, there were 8 or 9 synagogues, including the Beit Knesset Hagra, and a synagogue that dated back to the Middle Ages. This person remembered what the Vilna Shulhof, the neighborhood where the synagogues were located, was like on Kol Nidrei night, when tens of thousands of Jews would congregate. On that Kol Nidrei night in 1945, he returned to the synagogue where his mother used to pray, and it was deserted. He used the phrase from this kina to describe his feelings. Where is the Torah and those who study it? Her place is desolate with none to dwell therein. I just want to leave this up a little bit because I think that there is something so powerful and so poignant about this. Even in as much as I agree with Rabbi Martyr that this conservatism was misplaced, but where the Rav is saying that the Holocaust survivor who returned to Vilna in 1945 and found Vilna totally desolate and completely empty and bereft, there was nothing there, whereas beforehand there had been this like Jewish cosmopolitan metropolis of Jewish prayer, of Jewish study, of Jews. And all of a sudden it's empty, it's been wiped out, it's decimated. And where this Holocaust survivor draws upon a kina in order to articulate what he's experiencing. And the Rav is saying here, that's it. Whatever happened in Vilna happened beforehand. And he's saying that, and he's saying that we don't come up with new methods of commemoration, with new compositions. I don't know whether or not, I know that there was at one point where the Rav tried to petition Menachem Begin around this question of Yom HaShoah versus Tisha B'Av. I don't know, I know that what I do know about the Rav is that it's hard to pin down what his actual positions were, What I can say is that his grandson, Rav Moshe Lichtenstein, very strongly and very clearly articulates the position that we need Yom HaShoah in Israel, that there are so many survivors in Israel. There are so many, the Holocaust plays such a central role in Israeli identity that it is appropriate to have a Yom HaShoah, a special, distinct day apart from Tisha B'Av in Israel to commemorate the Holocaust. And it requires its own commemoration. And we're too close to the Holocaust to say that we can subsume it under other tragedies. Rav Moshe Lichtenstein writes about this. I think actually, and Rabbi Martyr, you might know this better than I do, that a translation of Rav Moshe Lichtenstein's article about this, I think is in one of the YCT journals. Milin, I forgot what it's called, Milin Chavivim, something like that. So that's the case for commemorating the Holocaust on Tisha B'Av. And I want to take a few minutes and think about the implications theologically, politically, and what are some of the strengths and the weaknesses of this approach. So I want to open the floor and ask you, is this something, what are the problems? What are the opportunities? What are the implications? What ends up happening? Yeah, Brandon.
Oh no, I think it's a tricky problem on either side. I mean, I'll just tell a quick story. I happened to have been at a Shabbos meal, and there were people that politically were way to the left of me, and they got into a whole conversation about focus on the Holocaust and that we have to move on. And it was just so upsetting to me that I couldn't even verbalize my thoughts. I was in a sea of people who thought that we focused on it too much, and it was beyond upsetting. And when I think of something like that, it just makes you realize the importance of emphasizing the Holocaust and doing it in as many ways as you can, as you described at the beginning, which clearly would cut in favor of specific focus on it, unrelated to Tish B'Av. So
or both. In other words, I think I had this experience with one of my kids where this was a few years ago, and I said we were coming up to Tisha B'Av, and I said we're going to be fasting and whatever, and one of my children said, why? And I said, well, we're remembering the Beit HaMikdash. And they said, well, wasn't that like 2,000 years ago? And I think that what I heard in that comment was, why are we still mourning something that happened 2,000 years ago? But the Holocaust was so recent. There's no way to even, aside from the magnitude of and the scope of the Holocaust, there's something, it's so recent, we can still touch it. And maybe there's an argument for not limiting ourselves to just one medium. Yeah, Audrey.
Well, a couple of points. I agree that there should be Yom HaShoah, obviously, and I agree that at this moment in time we need to not lump it together, but find the unique ways of observing it. And I think I'm on an advisory board for a Holocaust Center. The Holocaust education for younger people has been turned to more positive, looking towards the future, like the strength and resilience that can be gained from, our family that were victims, and use that to become upstanders and to teach human rights and all of that. So there's all these lessons that can be learned from the Holocaust, and, educators are doing that. And, there was also a Seder done by Rabbi Weiss, which Rabbi Martyr turned me on to many years ago. And I think it was something to do on Tisha B'Av, similar to a Passover Seder, so that all of us here in America realize that we were all victims of an attempted genocide. And we should feel, as we do a Passover, that we were slaves in Egypt. We should all feel that, really strong empathy and part of, that our people were almost destroyed. And that's not something that you really, can single out in one day or even 2 days a year. And, so I, of course, think that there's all different ways of doing it, and that we should not focus perhaps on the fasting and the sad stories, but on what lessons we can get from it and what strength we can derive from
or
having
maybe,
survived that genocide.
Or maybe it's both. In other words, maybe, and maybe Tisha B'Av is the day. Well, I don't know which one is the day, but maybe there's room on the calendar to try to think about the important lessons.
So how can I make myself see?
And maybe there's also room on the positive lessons and of moving forward. And maybe there's also room on the calendar to appreciate just the death and the destruction and the decimation. Where maybe because we're so close to it, we're still in a position where we actually need both. We need both pieces. I remember, anyway.
And the only justice that the victims get is to be remembered and acknowledged.
Right. Right. And I think that raises the question of what the difference is between mourning and commemoration. Maybe those things have different emphases. So I appreciate that.
And also celebrating, sorry to go on, but like you just said about Vilna, the rich, Jewish, vibrant history that was in Poland and in Eastern Europe before the war, that, I think should be emphasized in education also.
Right. Yes, Lona. But you're muted. You're still muted. Here, maybe I can help you. I'm not sure.
Okay, better now?
Yes.
Okay. So to tag, I lost it.
No, you're here. We hear you.
To tag on quickly before my battery goes, to tag on to what you said and what Audrey said, I think that we need to think about the future generations. Basically, everything we do is about commemorating and memory. Everything is about memory. And, fast days and Yom Tovim and education, everything we do is to perpetuate the memory of our history. And I think that Yom HaShoah is a large enough global, I don't even know if it's global, it's more than global. It was a part of our history that needs to be recognized, in my opinion, separately. Not for us, the immediate children of survivors or people who remember those who perished, but for our future children, grandchildren, because if we don't do it, it's going to be, unfortunately, diminished. We have to have a day or some kind of a commemoration that said, this happened. We need to honor the survivors, and of course honor those who did not survive. And the only way to do it is with a day. I mean, I know, observing Tisha B'Av, observing Yom Kippur, observing Rosh, everything that we observe in our life, in our family, is a memory. Conjures up a memory.
Yep.
And our children learn from that. And I think we need to think about the future generations, no matter how we do it, whether we do it through education, but in addition to the education, and in addition to the, the spotlighting of who survived, we need a day that is mourned and remembered in Israel and, throughout the world. I think it needs to be a day of, just for the show.
Distinct, great. Well, we're going to end with a question about education. And I think that it's a really important question. Which one of these models, Tisha B'Av, I was kind of making it easy for myself. Well, when I said, well, maybe we could have both, but they are two different models. And I think the question of which one of these avenues is a better way to commemorate the Holocaust, and not just commemorate, but like you said, Lona, to perpetuate the memory of the Holocaust is that's an important angle. And hopefully we'll end with that. I want to highlight a few of the implications that necessarily come along with commemorating the Holocaust on Tisha B'Av. The first thing that I want to note is that it means, like I said before, it is a Jewish tragedy. It is a particularistically Jewish tragedy, and it fits into a certain paradigm, a pre-established, precedented paradigm. It's one more, and I think that from a historical point of view, what it emphasizes perhaps is that the Holocaust is a culmination, and I'm sure that historians might have much more complex and nuanced things to say about this question, but that the Holocaust is the culmination of centuries of persecution, of anti-Semitism, of massacres that included the Crusader massacre, the Rhineland massacres, that included the Khmelnytsky pogrom and various other pogroms. And the Holocaust was the culmination of that. And when you commemorate it on Tisha B'Av, you capture that long trajectory leading up to the Holocaust. That's one thing. It did not happen in a vacuum. I would also say that and this might be a strength and a weakness, that it's a religious day. So on the one hand, there's something exclusionary about Tisha B'Av because it is a religious day, and it is a day that religious people observe, which means that if that is the day when we commemorate the Holocaust, then we lose a large segment of the Jewish people. On the other hand, there's also something very powerful about bringing religious rituals and norms to bear on Holocaust commemoration. I can say personally, a long time ago when I was young and maybe more energetic and passionate, I tried to fast on Yom HaShoah, and I only lasted 2 hours. It didn't work. So, I mean, there's something, can you imagine if all Jews designated Tisha B'Av as the day for Holocaust remembrance, and everybody was fasting, and nobody was greeting each other, and everybody was sitting on the floor, and bringing to bear all of these very established religious rituals of mourning to bear on the Holocaust. So I think it's important to point out that if we commemorate the Holocaust on Tisha B'Av, it comes along with a certain religious languages and rituals. I also want to say, and this is uncomfortable to say, that when we commemorate the Holocaust on Tisha B'Av, it creates a certain theological problem. If I can put it that way, that typically on Tisha B'Av we have a certain theology. Mipnei chata'enu galinu me'artzenu. It is because of our sins that we were exiled from our land. That's the emphasis of Tisha B'Av. That it's theodicy. Sin yields divine punishment. And God uses the tools of the Romans or the Babylonians and then the Romans as agents to enact God's punishment of the Jewish people. And it feels problematic, to say the least, to bring the Holocaust into that theological paradigm. I should point out that there might be room to say that doesn't have to be the case. Because if you read the Hebrew Crusader Chronicles, you know that the authors of these chronicles say the people who died in 1096 were actually pure. They were blameless. They did nothing, and if anything, God owes them. They sacrificed themselves. In fact, there's an amazing line in the Crusader Chronicles where they say, oh, you think Abraham was so great? Abraham brought one son to the altar, these people actually slaughtered 1,000 Isaacs. And they basically say, we surpassed the past generations, and God, at this point, you are in the red when it comes to the ledger. You owe us. But I think that the question that really emerges from this debate and from the Grizz and then the Rav around using Tisha B'Av, whether using the day or using the keynote as a way to commemorate the Holocaust, what really emerges is this question of whether we want to use what's traditional, what is coherent, what is precedented, what is established in terms of the norms and the behaviors and the rituals. And that would entail using Tisha B'Av as the means or the mechanism of commemorating the Holocaust. Or do we want to turn to something different? Do we want to turn to something that is new and something that is unprecedented, because the Holocaust is new and is unprecedented? With the time that we have, and again, if anybody needs to hop off, of course, I understand, but I'm hopefully going to get to 2:15. I want to turn to Yom HaShoah, because if not Tisha B'Av, if we don't feel comfortable using Tisha B'Av as the primary means of commemorating the Holocaust, then we are left with Yom HaShoah. Now, Yom HaShoah, or the 27th of Nisan, emerged, like I said in the beginning, as a political compromise in the 1950s. In 1959, it became the law passed by the Knesset in Israel. And there were at least 2 or 3 years of intense debate in Israel, in the Knesset, around when Yom HaShoah should happen. On the one hand, there was a very strong group of ghetto fighters, of partisans, of people from the underground resistance who had emigrated to Israel and who advocated for a day called Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura, the day of Holocaust and heroism. And they wanted this day to fall out on the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising on the 14th and 15th day of Nisan. That's when the uprising began, in response to the Nazis, to the beginning of the Nazi attempt or of the Nazi destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto. Now, of course, the 14th and the 15th day of Nisan is Erev Pesach. And this group of people said, I don't want it to fall on the secular calendar. I don't want it to be April 19th. I want it to fall on the Hebrew day that the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising started. There was a very strong Orthodox resistance to this idea. Why? Because how could you possibly commemorate the Holocaust on Erev Pesach? There are halachic reasons saying that you cannot have anything close to mourning on that day, and you can't even have anything close to mourning throughout the month of Nisan. This group also, which generally but not exclusively came from Orthodox quarters, also said to focus on resistance on the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was to ignore the groups of Jews who did not resist or who never had the opportunity to resist. And they said, we want to push it into Iyar. We want to get it as far away from Pesach as possible. So after a few years of debate, the Labor Party in Israel provided the decisive vote. There's kind of this unconfirmed rumors that there was a payoff involved to the Labor Party. Nobody's ever confirmed that. But the compromise was the 27th of Nisan. And essentially, nobody got their way. It was still in Nisan, so halachically, that was problematic, especially for the Haredim, who said, you're not allowed to have any mourning during the month of Nisan. And it was also problematic for the ghetto fighters who said we wanted it as close to the Warsaw Ghetto as possible, and it was pushed off from that. And what I think that this reflects is that this is a broken day. Yom HaShoah is a broken day, and there's something actually meaningful about the fact that it is an empty, broken, maybe even an incoherent day. What did it mean for the ghetto fighters to commemorate Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura on the 14th and the 15th day of Nisan? What did that mean for them in terms of Jewish identity? What were they trying to say? They were trying to say that Jewish identity in the modern world it's not just about death and destruction, but it's about Jews standing up and fighting back. It is an empowered identity. It is about Jews having agency, Jews having power. And of course, they were creating continuity between what happened in the Warsaw Ghetto and what was unfolding in the modern state of Israel. They were saying that this is what we see as significant is a modern, sovereign, empowered vision of Jewish identity and nationalism. And of course, that did not really come to be. That their vision was not entirely realized. And in some ways, you could say that nobody got their way, and in that sense that the day is empty. But on the other hand, maybe you can say that this emptiness actually represents a call to action. And for this, I'm really drawing on Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg's idea of a broken covenant in the wake of the Holocaust and Yom HaShoah being a broken day that reflects this broken covenant. What do I mean by that? What is Yom HaShoah? It's a day, it's at the end of Nisan, but not that close to Pesach. It's close to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, but a little bit distant. It's a day where everybody circles it and endows the day with a meaning that they think belongs to the Holocaust, that they think the day needs to express. And in this sense, the day calls on us. It calls on us to assume responsibility for commemoration, for mourning, and for memory. For, like Audrey said before, for giving the day or for extracting from the day the positive lessons, perhaps, that they think the day needs to carry. It's a day that calls on us. And I think that this reflects what Rabbi Greenberg says about the Holocaust in general, where Rabbi Greenberg says the Holocaust broke us. The Jewish people were broken. The Torah is broken. God is hidden. Maybe even God is broken. Everything broke in the wake of the Holocaust. Nothing was exempt from suffering. And what does this mean for the Jewish people? God hid God's self. And at this point, the Jewish people have to step in, and the Jewish people have to assume full responsibility for the covenant. The world is a broken place. It has deep fissures. And this model of the covenant, of a broken covenant, more aptly represents the world that we live in, a broken world. And in this sense, Yom HaShoah is also a broken day to reflect a broken world, to reflect a broken covenant. But in its emptiness, it calls on us to act. I wanted to just quickly show you Rabbi Greenberg's piece, where he says, behind the various proposals to locate Yom HaShoah on the Jewish calendar was a clash of values. Given the differing interpretations of the meaning of the Holocaust, it was hardly surprising that groups disagreed on the proper date and methods of memorializing the Shoah. To have allowed any one interested group to determine the specific date of Yom HaShoah would have meant overriding the others' models. So we couldn't have it on Erev Pesach, but we also couldn't have it in Iyar. Or you couldn't have it maybe past Yom HaAtzmaut, which is the 5th of Iyar. To have accepted from any of the groups the date required by their own reckoning would be equivalent to saying that their paradigm of interpreting the Holocaust was 100% correct. But was any one group's vision of Judaism totally correct and unscathed by the Shoah? No such perfect model exists. Perfection is least of all possible when it comes to dealing with a Holocaust. Only a broken date drawn from a broken paradigm could be appropriated for Yom HaShoah. The Holocaust reveals that behind the flux of history is an ideal paradigm that is fragmentary, broken. We'll just skip a little bit. No belief system or philosophy can be perfect if it seeks to deal with or grow out of reality, which includes the Holocaust. The discovery of failure, the critique of a system, is the key to reconciling it with reality and making it capable of coping. So what Rabbi Greenberg here is saying is that having a broken covenant with God, having a broken system, having a broken day is the best way to deal with the reality of the Holocaust. And that's what is so powerful about Yom HaShoah. I wanted to skip to this last source. And I just want to recommend this piece if you're interested in this question of a Holocaust commemoration by Rabbi J.J. Schachter. It's a piece in tradition, Holocaust Commemoration and Tisha B'Av, the debate over Yom HaShoah. And Rabbi Schachter is, of course, a leading expert on this question. And I want to end by reading what he writes. He says, I continue to suspect that more and more communal commemorations are attended by less and less. He's talking about Yom HaShoah. The fact remains that nothing formal was ever done to anchor the collective memory of one of the most horrific events, if not the most horrific in Jewish history, in the context of any religiously mandated ritual behavior. And I fear we are already paying and will continue to pay a heavy price for this neglect. I just want to say this is a tremendous indictment, and it's a very serious warning to future generations of Jews, as Lona mentioned earlier. In the end, I am deeply concerned that neither Tisha B'Av nor the 27th of Nisan will serve as lasting memorials, l'dorot, for all future generations. So something permanent, not something temporary. For hachasidim, vayisharim, vatmeimim, kihilot hakodesh shemasru nafsham al kedushat Hashem. For these pure, innocent souls who gave their lives for the sanctification of God's name. So he's saying that neither one of these dates will serve as lasting memorials for all of these people who died in the conflagration that consumed 6 million of our people some 60 to 70 years ago. Hashem yinkom damam. God should avenge their blood. I just want to stop for a moment and think about what it means that Rabbi Schachter is saying this, that he is concerned, that he's terrified that neither one of these models will serve as a permanent memorial for the Holocaust, and that in the end, the memory of the Holocaust will actually slip through and become something that we don't actually hold on to as the Jewish people, as a Jewish collective. So, like I said, for one thing, it is a tremendous indictment, and it should serve as a warning. But I actually wonder if perhaps having maybe the answer to Rabbi Schachter, or maybe one answer, is that we can't actually have one, that each one of these days represents a different way or mode of commemorating the Holocaust, and that Holocaust commemoration, by virtue of its scope, by virtue of what was precedented and unprecedented in it, actually requires two distinctive models for commemoration, and that each one commemorates a different aspect of the Holocaust, and sometimes they're actually competing with each other. That Tisha B'Av and Yom HaShoah don't coexist comfortably, that there's conflict and tension between the two of them, but that we actually need both of them to commemorate different aspects of the Shoah. I want to stop for any questions or any comments. Yes, Michelle.
Well, I actually had just a realization as you were going through everything that even during my own lifetime, I think when I was younger, I couldn't possibly imagine you would ever forget, or the Holocaust would somehow fade in memory, and that you would need to link it to to Tisha B'Av in order to make it stick around.
Right.
But I actually feel like at this point in my lifetime, you start to see, oh no, this really could happen. And we have to somehow link the most recent memory of something to all the others, so that we can emotionally, we can deal with it better. How do you spend your Tisha B'Av? We should be spending it both remembering the thing we really can't remember and the thing we really can remember. And then by blending them, you make the day meaningful, and then you're doing a proper commemoration. But if you don't link the most recent horrific thing, it is a lot harder. Right.
That's what I think. That, yes, agreed 100%, that at the end of the day, the Churban it just doesn't pull on me in the way that the Holocaust does. Not even remotely. And I don't know what to do with the fact, like with the possibility that the way to make sure that the Holocaust stays in our Jewish collective consciousness is to keep it in Tisha B'Av. I don't know what that means about Yom HaShoah. It's a frightening prospect. I think also something that we didn't talk about is that Yom HaShoah, it can be linked to Yom HaAtzmaut, but it doesn't have to be linked to Yom HaAtzmaut. And I think because of that, it has the potential to play out very differently in Israel versus elsewhere around the world. I think that also is a place where we need further inquiry and further thought. Are we linking it with the state of Israel, or are we unlinking it with the establishment of the state of Israel? And I think that carries other implications as well. Yeah, Shira.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think, especially listening to you articulate it and go through the sources through this past hour and Samad, first of all, thank you. I thought that was super compelling, super meaningful and interesting. And also, I think it makes a really good case for both days. I do think we need to have Holocaust memorialized as part of our religious tradition, which is what Tisha B'Av does. But it's also in many ways a very personal day. We're sort of at home with our families, with our fasting and our headaches or whatever it is. And there's a sort of a broader educational component and a communal memorialization on Yom HaShoah that doesn't it doesn't matter whether or not you're religiously observant. And it's sort of a looking outwards and making sure all Jews and all of the world remembers, what happened.
I think yes, I think that's so true, that there's something a little bit more universalizable about Yom HaShoah that you just cannot get to with Tisha B'Av. That I grew up with a very close family friend who was a Holocaust survivor, and she goes into public schools every Yom HaShoah and speaks, and it's had a tremendous impact, and it's on Yom HaShoah. So, and I think that thinking about the world and thinking about America and thinking about our broader society and how we communicate out the Holocaust, it's not, of course, it's a Jewish particularistic tragedy, but it has to be a story and a history. It's a story. The stories and the histories have to get played out on the universal. Have to get played out universally as well. And how we do that is a really important question. And I think you're right that Yom HaShoah affords that possibility in a way that Tisha B'Av does not. So I appreciate that. Thank you, everybody. I forgot what we say at the when we at least I don't remember if it's a Sephardic phrase or an Ashkenaz phrase, but Tir'u b'nachamat Zion, something like that. But I hope you have an easy and meaningful rest of your fast. And thanks for joining, and thanks for your insights. Take care.
Thank you, Sarah.